Saint Hilda's life fell entirely within the 7th century AD, one of the most interesting in England's history. All we know of Saint Hilda we owe to the writings of Saint Bede, a Benedictine monk at Jarrow, who wrote the history of the Catholic faith in England and tells of the holy princess who gave up everything to serve God as a Benedictine abbess. By the early 600s, separate waves of Anglo-Saxon invasion had ended, and England was not yet a unified country. She was born in 614, a princess in the royal household of the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was made up of northern England and southeast Scotland. This was the time when Pope St. Gregory the Great was sending Benedictine monks as missionaries to England to bring its people to know our Catholic faith again since the fall of the Roman Empire 2 centuries before. The people of Northumbria, as was Hilda's family, were pagan followers, and she was raised as such until her great-uncle, King Edwin, married a Catholic noblewoman, Ethelbert. St. Paulinus, one of these missionaries who accompanied her as her chaplain, was asked by the king to baptize him and his entire family in 627. The people of Northumbria followed, making this an historic turning point in England's history and to mark the place of this famous baptism. The great Cathedral of York, second largest in all of Northern Europe, was built. The royal family members took on the responsibility for spreading the faith by devoting themselves to supporting the Benedictine order of monks and nuns. They built convents and monasteries. Often, they would become members themselves after the death of a spouse, as in the case of Queen Ethelbert, who did just that, founding a monastery near the southern English coast of Lymond, and becoming its abbess after the death of King Edwin. Hilda is believed to have lived with the queen there during this time.
Hilda's sister Eriswith as well joined a Benedictine convent across the English Channel from Limoges in northern France after being widowed. It wasn't long before the pious young princess decided to dedicate her life to God and initially planned to join her sister in France. That didn't happen. Instead, St. Aidan, abbot and bishop of the island monastery of Lindisfarne, persuaded Hilda to pursue her monastic vocation in her native Northumbria. Christianity had been brought to the British Isles, where they were part of the Roman Empire, but after the fall of the empire, many areas reverted to being pagan, while small pockets of Christians remained that developed the Celtic traditions of the faith. St. Aidan was one of those who promoted early Celtic traditions in the 7th century Scotland. While Hilda was in the south, Northumbria was again overrun by the Mercians and relapsed into paganism. Some Christians remaining sent a missionary appeal to Scotland for help, to which St. Aidan responded, and one more Christianity was established in Northumbria following the Celtic traditions. To help with promoting Christianity in Northumbria, he felt that Hilda had the talent to organize the religious life for women there, and so her life's work was begun. First, Hilda was put in charge of a group of women in a small religious house on the river where St. Aidan. She realized she was ready for further responsibilities, and a year later, she became the abbess of the abbey at Hartlepool, leading this community for the next 9 years. Later, Abbess Hilda of Hartlepool was offered a parcel of land near a settlement at the mouth of the River Esk, where a church had been built and her great-uncle, King Edwin, had been buried. So, in 657, Hilda founded the Abbey of Whitby, and led it until her death in 680. Legend has it that the ammonite fossils found on the shore at Whitby are the petrified remains of snakes that once infested the area. Hilda brought the infestation to an end by turning the snakes into stone to clear a site for the building of her abbey. Therefore, a snake is one of her symbols, along with the bishop's staff and a model of an abbey.
Her life as abbess there was many-sided. First, she was the spiritual leader of a large community of both nuns and monks studying for the service of God. 5 of these monks later became bishops, 2 of which, John of Beverley, Bishop of Hexham, and Wilfrid, Bishop of York, were canonized saints for their service to the Church at a critical period in its fight against paganism. Also, as a landowner, she had many in her employ to care for sheep and cattle, farming, and lumber milling. St. Bede describes Hilda as a woman of great energy, who was a skilled administrator and teacher. She gained such a reputation for wisdom that even kings and princes sought her advice. but she also had a concern for ordinary folk like Caedmon. In the year 657, Caedmon came to work for the abbey, looking after the cattle. Caedmon was a good cowherd, but a terrible singer. In those days, it was the custom for the guests at a feast to entertain each other with songs, but when Caedmon saw his turn approaching, he would leave the hall to avoid it. One night, he left early and settled down to sleep in the stable, where it was his turn to guard the animals. While he slept, he dreamt that he heard a voice asking him to sing. He refused, saying that he could not do it. The voice spoke again, "You shall sing to me. Sing about the creation of all things." And in his dream, Caedmon sang in praise of God the Creator. When he woke, he found that God had given him the gift of song. His master sent him to the Abbess Hilda to tell her what had happened and to sing to her. Realizing that he had indeed been given a wonderful talent, Hilda welcomed him into the monastery as a brother monk and arranged for him to be instructed in the great stories of the Bible. The rest of Caedmon's life was spent composing poems and songs to tell people about God and his works, and to encourage them to turn their lives to good. Caedmon is now known as the father of English poetry.
Although Hilda must have had a strong character, she inspired affection. As St. Bede writes, all who knew her called her mother, because of her outstanding devotion and grace. Under Hilda's talented leadership, her abbey at Whitby came to be counted among the religious, intellectual, and cultural powerhouses of 7th century Christendom. In Northumbria, the church had been celebrating the Celtic liturgy and following Celtic traditions for how to live the monastic life. But in southern England, the church had adopted the rule of St. Benedict and celebrated the Mass in Latin. Because there were these divisions in the church, King Oswiu called a synod at Whitby in 664 to resolve the problem, which also centered on how the date of Easter was arrived at. This was critical, as the calendar in those days was all based around the date of Easter. Two different ways of setting it made for two different calendars that the country was using. Hilda was originally sympathetic to the Celtic traditions that she had been following ever since she returned from Liminge, but she accepted the decision of the synod to adopt Roman customs to unite with the Pope in Rome. Now the church would be united throughout all of England, and Hilda worked to promote it out of obedience and humility. Her allegiance to observance was shown by the dedication of her monastery to St. Peter, the apostle and first pope who was martyred in Rome, and she had a member of her community compose a biography of Pope St. Gregory the Great.
St. Hilda suffered from fevers for the last 7 years of her life, but she continued to work until her death on November 17th, 680 AD, at what was then the advanced age of 66. In her last year, she set up another monastery 14 miles from Whitby at Hackness. She died after receiving Holy Communion and advising everyone to live in peace through service to the gospel. Visions of St. Hilda's soul being carried to heaven by angels were a sure sign of her sanctity, and a holy day celebrated in St. Hilda's honor on the anniversary of her death soon found its way into church calendars and was celebrated as far away as the Netherlands. Her feast day of November 17th continues to be celebrated over 1,300 years later. St. Hilda is one of the patron saints of learning and culture, including poetry due to her patronage of Caedmon. St. Hilda is the patron saint of the National Cathedral School for Girls in Washington, D.C., as well as many schools and parishes over all the English-speaking world, from England to India and Australia, besides the students of Hilda House at St. Ben's.